The slap cracked through the first-class cabin of Flight 732 like a thunderclap. Head snapped around. Conversation halted mid-sentence. A champagne glass trembled on its tray. And for a brief, breathless moment, time froze. 17-year-old Jalen Montgomery sat motionless, one hand lifted in disbelief to his cheek where a deep sting bloomed red. He stared up at the man who had just struck him, a red-faced, silver-haired passenger, trembling with rage, veins bulging from his neck. "You don't belong here," the man spat through clenched teeth, his voice seething. "I paid $20,000 for peace, not to be seated next to—" He didn't finish. He didn't get the chance. Two men in dark suits, seated quietly in the bulkhead row moments earlier, now surged into action. With swift, practiced movements, they closed the distance in seconds, wrestling the older man back against the cabin wall, his arms wrenched behind him. Passengers gasped. A flight attendant dropped her drink tray. The intercom crackled. "Captain," came the panicked voice. "We have an incident in first class." Captain Maya Chun, halfway through a calm cruise at 36,000 feet, snapped her headset into place and began relaying instructions to air traffic control. "Request emergency landing clearance. We have an onboard assault." But in Seat 2A, Solomon Montgomery didn't flinch. Dressed in a navy suit with subtle pinstripes and a silk tie the color of storm clouds, he sat as composed as ever, one hand now resting gently on his son's forearm. "Breathe," he said softly. "Stay still. This is exactly what we talked about." His voice was even, measured, but his eyes blazed. Across the aisle, in Seat 3C, a woman in her 60s with elegant gray curls and a phone held discreetly in hand, never stopped recording. The man pinned to the wall was Dr. Franklin Tate, a renowned thoracic surgeon from Boston. He had just destroyed his reputation with a single slap, unaware that a camera lens was capturing everything. But to understand how Flight 732 reached this flashpoint, you need to rewind the clock just 4 hours to a quiet, uneventful morning at Logan International Airport. At Gate B-17, Regina Alvarez had worked passenger boarding for 28 years. She'd seen it all: celebrities in sunglasses, panicked business travelers, honeymooners arguing over passports. But nothing tested her patience more than the entitled ballet of first-class boarding. That morning was no exception. "Excuse me," came a crisp voice from her right. Dr. Franklin Tate, dignified in a tailored gray suit and polished Oxfords, presented his boarding pass without making eye contact. "I need a pre-board. I have a medical conference call in precisely 22 minutes. Regina offered her standard smile. "Of course, Dr. Tate, but we're still waiting for flight crew clearance. We'll begin boarding soon." He gave a thin, dissatisfied smile. "You may not understand, but I'm presenting research that could save lives. Timing matters." Behind him, a young woman in sunglasses with a golden retriever service dog tapped her cane gently on the floor. "Pre-boardings for passengers with disabilities," she said quietly. Tate turned, eyes dropping to her white cane. His smile shifted into something like mock sympathy. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Please, by all means." But under his breath, he added, "Even if some of us are trying to save lives." Regina ignored the comment, ushering the woman and her dog forward. "Thank you, MS. Desai. You're in 4F. Minutes later, a tall, broad-shouldered black man approached the counter, a teenage boy at his side. "Solomon Montgomery and my son, Jalen," he said in a voice like warm mahogany. Calm, composed, understated confidence. Regina's eyebrows lifted slightly. Everyone knew the name. Solomon Montgomery, the first black majority owner of a major Boston tech firm, a billionaire investor, and a well-respected philanthropist. The man who had donated $80 million to revamp the pediatric wing at Franklin Tate's very own hospital. She smiled. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Montgomery. Seats 2A and 2B. We'll be boarding shortly." Jalen shifted from foot to foot, his expensive charcoal gray suit looking slightly too formal for a teenager. "Dad, can I grab a water?" Solomon checked his Rolex. Quickly. 5 minutes. As Jalen jogged off toward the kiosk, Solomon turned back. Captain Chun flying today? Yes, sir, Regina replied. Tell her Solomon says hello. As Regina nodded, Franklin Tate, who had been watching from nearby, scoffed audibly. Of course, he muttered. VIPs and their special treatment. To him, Solomon was a businessman, maybe an athlete. Certainly not someone he considered an equal in intellect or importance. By the time Jalen returned with a protein bar and a bottle of water, Gate B17 was beginning to fill. Elderly passengers, tech bros, a professor grading papers, and a wiry man with rumpled khakis balancing a coffee cup and a laptop under one arm. You heading to San Fran? The man asked Jalen. Yes, sir, Jalen nodded. My dad's already in line. Cool, the man replied distractedly, glancing at the boarding screen. I'm stuck back in row 27. Enjoy first class for both of us. Back at the gate, boarding finally began. Solomon and Jalen waited politely, letting a military veteran and an elderly couple go ahead. Always give space, Solomon had said many times. Manners are currency. Once aboard, first class shimmered with quiet wealth. Plush pods, personalized greetings, a soft playlist humming beneath the ambient cabin noise. Window or aisle? Solomon asked, already knowing the answer. Window, Jalen grinned. Across the cabin, Dr. Franklin Tate settled into 1A and immediately asked for a glass of sparkling water, not too chilled. As passengers trickled in, Diana, the lead flight attendant, moved gracefully through the rows. Dr. Tate, she said warmly. Welcome back. He nodded, but didn't look up. Has the cabin temperature been adjusted? It's already warm. I'll check with the cockpit, Diana replied, unfazed. By the time the final boarding call sounded, first class was full. In seat 3D, Trevor Main, a venture capitalist in his 30s, flipped through pitch decks on a tablet. Beside him, Caroline Westfield, widowed banking heiress, sipped from a porcelain mug. As the plane taxied out, Jalen watched the ground fall away with wide eyes. Solomon closed his eyes, hands resting on his thighs. Takeoff was his time for reflection. Transition. He had done this flight 100 times, but this one felt different. Next to them, Franklin Tate shifted impatiently. He checked his watch. Again and again. The meal service began. Salmon and truffle risotto. Creme brulee. Sparkling water, espresso, or Krug. I'll have the Krug, Dr. Tate said loudly. Not the house sparkling. When Diana offered a hot towel to Solomon and Jalen, Dr. Tate rolled his eyes. Amazing what money can buy these days, he muttered. Solomon glanced over. Excuse me? Tate gave a tight smile. Nothing. Enjoy your flight. The tension built slowly. A look here. A scoff there. But it wasn't until mid-flight, after turbulence, after small talk, after an unexpected medical emergency in row 27 that things truly shifted. Dr. Tate had responded reluctantly when a passenger went into cardiac distress, only standing after Diana, all but begged. Returning from the rear cabin 30 minutes later, he walked taller. Patient stabilized, he announced. But what followed wasn't gratitude. It was arrogance. This is why standards matter, he said aloud. The value of true training. Not everyone deserves to be in this cabin. Marcus turned. Excuse me. Tate faced him squarely. No offense, young man, but this isn't a classroom or a sports locker room. First class used to mean something. Solomon stood slowly. Dr. Tate, I think you should stop. Why? He snapped. Because the truth makes people uncomfortable. And then slapped Jalen. The rest you already know. As Jalen sat frozen in stunned silence, Solomon rose from his seat, a dark wave of restrained fury building behind his eyes. But before he could move, his security detail had already acted. The two men, John and Malik, each over 6 feet tall, and trained in personal protection, had Dr. Tate restrained against the cabin bulkhead within seconds. Sir, remain calm, John said firmly as he applied pressure to Tate's shoulder joint. You've just assaulted a minor on a federal aircraft. Let go of me, Tate bellowed, spittle flying, face purple with rage. I'll have your badges. This is assault. Actually, Malik replied without emotion. It's self-defense. And you're under observation until the captain says otherwise. Flight attendant scrambled. Diana was already on the intercom. Captain, we have a physical altercation in first class. Requesting immediate diversion instructions. Repeat. Passenger-on-passenger assault confirmed. Security team on board is containing. Up in the cockpit, Captain Chun was already ahead of the situation. Tower, this is Flight 732. Requesting emergency diversion to Denver International. Medical and law enforcement presence needed on arrival. Back in first class, Solomon turned to Jalen. Are you hurt? Jalen shook his head, though his cheek was still flushed red, his chest rising and falling with sharp breaths. I'm fine, he whispered, trying to will away the sting in his eyes. I am okay. Solomon didn't respond immediately. His gaze swept the cabin. Not a single passenger had spoken up. Not one had intervened when the slap echoed. Trevor Main had ducked behind his tablet. Caroline Westfield, still filming, lowered her phone slightly, her expression unreadable. Even the Abernethys Herald and Dorothy sat frozen, unsure whether to speak. Only one voice broke the silence. From 3C, Caroline Westfield stood. I witnessed the entire incident, she said clearly, and I have it recorded beginning to end, including the verbal provocation. Dr. Tate's face blanched. I'll need your phone, ma'am, Diana said, approaching with a trembling notepad. You'll get a copy, Caroline replied calmly. This footage is going straight to the FAA and my attorneys. Jalen still hadn't moved. Solomon crouched beside his son. Breathe, he whispered again. You did nothing wrong. Across the aisle, Tate had gone silent, breathing heavily through his nose. His arms were still restrained, but the fire in his eyes had faded, replaced by something else fear. Solomon stood and faced the cabin. I want it understood, he said to everyone, that my son 17 years old was assaulted on this flight without provocation. By a man with a history of entitlement who thought his seat gave him the right to strike another human being. The words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were measured, controlled, delivered with the gravitas of someone who had faced far worse with far less power to respond. Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom once more. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to an onboard incident, we will be diverting to Denver International Airport. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Law enforcement will meet us at the gate. The collective reaction from first class was a mix of unease and guilt. Franklin Tate, meanwhile, had begun to slump in his restraints. Do you know who I am? He muttered. Yes, Solomon said coolly. And in about 3 hours, so will the rest of the country. By the time the plane touched down, the Denver tarmac was flanked with flashing lights. TSA officers and local police stood waiting just beyond the jetway. Flight 732 taxied to a halt, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. But no one moved. John and Malik escorted Tate off the plane in silence. As they passed Diana, she stepped aside, but not without a final glance of disappointment. He's been removed, Captain Chun confirmed over the speakers. We'll be on the ground for approximately an hour while authorities process the situation. You are free to disembark if Denver is your destination. Otherwise, please remain seated. In the stillness that followed, a quiet round of applause broke out. It started with Caroline Westfield, then Dorothy Abernathy, then a young engineer in row 5. Soon, half the cabin was clapping not in celebration, but in acknowledgement. Of injustice seen, of power wielded properly, of dignity maintained under fire. Jalen finally spoke. Can I go to the restroom? Go ahead, Solomon said, eyes still fixed on the aisle. When his son was gone, Caroline leaned across the aisle. Mr. Montgomery, she said quietly. That could have gone very differently. Thank you for keeping your composure. Solomon nodded. Thank you for filming. I wasn't the only witness, but I might have been the only one willing to act. As the door opened and law enforcement stepped on board, Diana turned to Solomon. The captain would like to speak with you privately before we resume. Solomon stood, adjusted his cuffs, walked to the front of the plane. He moved like a man who had spent a lifetime calculating how the world would perceive every movement, every word, every reaction. And yet, something about today had changed that calculus. For once, the world had seen the whole picture live, unedited, undeniable. And this time, it was the truth that went viral.